yeah, I will go ahead and get recording first. So,
Fantastic. Please, no problem.
I guess to start off first, can you just introduce yourself and say your name, just to ensure that when you have the anchor introduce the second, you're saying your name correctly.
Yeah, am I clear? I'll make sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm Richard Hidarian. I currently teach international relations at the University of the Philippines, Diliman Asian Center. I'm also a columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, among other things, and I've written a couple of books, including on the Indo-Pacific geopolitical rivalry and the South China Sea disputes, which are one of my main research focus areas.
Right, perfect. Um, and sorry, is your just want to make sure I have like the angle right. Okay, perfect. Yeah, just moving on. I guess to kind of start off with the big picture question, can you just kind of explain the significance of the South China Sea, in terms of like what China kind of sees as kind of trying to use the right words, maybe not aggressive, but it's making much more of a stake out there, making its presence more known, and just larger for other countries. Like I know it has like a lot of trade shipping routes, stuff like that, just to kind of understand its significance, its importance.
Well, when it comes to the South China Sea disputes, it's where the parameters of great power rivalry between the United States and China are most poignant and potentially explosive. I think that's what makes it globally relevant. In addition to the obvious fact that it's a major sea line of communication, trillions of dollars of trade passes through the South China Sea. I've heard numbers between $3 to $5 trillion. There are different ways to count it, but in many ways, it's a gateway of trade, not only between the United States and rest of Asia, but also between Europe and the Middle East and Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. So it's a global artery of trade. Importantly, of course, it is also home to untold amount of fisheries and importantly also oil and gas resources, particularly close to the contested areas like in the Reed Bank area, which falls within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, and it is neighboring the Spratly group of islands, which China claims as part of its nine dash line. So you have the confluence of many interests and many fault lines, which is why the South China Sea is a potentially a powder keg, or could be potentially the front line of a much more muscular competition, if not all-out confrontation between the United States and China. For us in Southeast Asia region, of course, the South China Sea, and particularly the areas we call West Philippine Sea, our exclusive economic zone there. In the case of the Vietnamese, the East Sea. And interestingly, even the Indonesians, they call North Natuna Sea some parts of their exclusive economic zone that overlaps with China's claims in the South China Sea basin. You see, these areas are vital to our food security. Hundreds of millions of people across the Southeast Asian region rely on protein intake and fishery resources there. And millions of people directly rely on access to those fishery resources for their livelihood. But as I said, it's also a question of energy security. In the case of the Philippines, it's actually a very urgent issue. The Malampaya plant, which is our primary source of liquefied natural gas, which powers our electricity in much of the industrialized parts of the Philippines, that plant is running out very soon. So if we don't develop alternative sources, including the one in the Reed Bank, the Philippines is also facing an energy security crisis. So that is why the stakes are extremely high. So this is not just a question of territorial or maritime disputes, it's also resource competition. And lastly, I would say that what makes also the South China Sea extremely important is that it involves matters of national identity. And in the case of China, a question of leadership and some would say hegemonic identity. In the case of the Philippines, defending what is ours in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, it's about patriotism, it's about a sense of nationhood. I describe it as a moment of refounding of the Filipino nation because, for the first time in more than a century, we have to directly deal with an external security threat. And unlike before, the Philippines is no longer fully relying on the United States to protect it from external security threats, something we can discuss more when we discuss our mutual defense treaty with the United States. But for China, It's also a question of nationalism. In the 1990s, they introduced a patriotic education program, which has inculcated the sense that basically the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, all of these areas are part of Mother China. In fact, some Chinese experts and even documents describe the South China Sea and East China Sea as their blue national soil. So there's also a question of identity and patriotism there that adds an element of complexity, because when questions of identity rise, compromise becomes much more difficult. I mean, you can divide resources and come up with some sort of an arithmetic to break it down. But when it becomes a question of national identity and national pride and patriotism, it makes it very difficult for leaders to make any compromise. So that's why whenever any regional leader tries to talk about a compromise, they immediately get criticized for being either soft, if not treasonous.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Um, yeah. Guess the next question I want to ask you was like kind of the alliance for military ties between the U.S. and the Philippines and how, including like if I remember right, the EDCA bases as well as I'm going to mispronounce it, but the military exercises, the Balaton
Balikatan, yeah, yeah.
stuff. Just because Balaton, thank you. And if I understand right, this alliance could potentially, well, I'm not sure how to use this for using it now, but could drag the U.S. into armed conflicts. And then just a quick question: where's your computer's camera at by chance? Or
Excuse me?
do you mind staring at your computer's camera real quick, just to kind of get where your eyes are going?
I mean, move farther, you mean?
Oh no, just the way it's movie is set up is just I want to make sure that you're either kind of like looking towards the TV or at the viewer. That kind of makes sense.
You want me to look at the camera?
Yes.
Okay, sure, sure. No problem. I'm using a laptop, so yeah.
Yes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So if we can just talk about the military ties alliance between the U.S. and the Philippines, and again, yeah, sorry to be rude, but just to start the camera as it will help, like you're looking at the viewer once you see it. So.
Is it okay now? I'm looking at the camera.
Oh yes. Sorry. Go ahead with your answer. Apologies.
Yeah, well, what makes this conflict very important, of course, for you guys in the United States is that since at least 2019, the United States has made it clear that it will come to the Philippines rescuing an event of conflict with a third party under very specific parameters. If any Filipino vessels, servicemen, or aircraft, public aircraft or public vessel, comes under attack by a third force in the South China Sea, automatically the Mutual Defense Treaty will apply. Just to be clear, the Mutual Defense Treaty is not a mutual offense treaty. It doesn't mean that the United States is going to come in and bomb the hell out of any third party. It just means that to begin with, there are steps. The two sides are going to convene. They can take the case to the National Security, to United Nations Security Council. The two sides can have consultations on any potential joint, military defensive response. So just to be clear, the mutual defense treaty is not a mutual offense treaty. So there's steps before we get into an all-out war. But at least what the United States has made it clear since 2019 is that the Philippines will not be on its own if it's soldiers, if it's Coast Guard vessels, if it's naval vessels and public aircrafts come under attack by a third party. And the only third party, obviously, we can think about at this point is China. Even if, of course, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, Vietnam was also a top rival to us. Now, just to be clear, why I said since 2019, because the reality is that between the Nixon administration, and this is a lot due to the legacy of Henry Kissinger, the United States developed for almost half a century a so-called strategic ambiguity doctrine, right? The circumstances are interesting. So in the 70s, when the United States was trying to build a kind of a counter alliance against the Soviet Union, it was building a good relationship with the Maoist China. And back then, the worry of the United States was the Philippines will drag the United States into potential conflict with China, and even South Vietnam, which at that time was still existing and a U.S. ally, because of its own claims in the area. And actually, in the 1970s, the Philippines, up until early 1970s, the Philippines had the most developed armed forces in Southeast Asia, one that could potentially even go toe to toe with China, which back then was an impoverished, isolated country. And the reason is simple because the United States, of course, armed the Philippines with state of the art fighter jets. The Philippines had a relatively advanced and well armed and well trained armed forces. Together with the United States, a lot of its officers were trained in the West Point. So the Philippines was like the little boogeyman in Southeast Asia. So these are all the classified documents whereby you see Henry Kissinger coming out and saying, yes, we are a Philippines treaty ally, but we're not going to be complicit in any self-aggrandizement move on the part of the Philippines that drags us into potential conflict with China and other countries that we're trying to build a de facto alliance with against our bigger enemy, which is the Soviet Union. So during the Nixon administration, the U.S. came up with this idea that okay, we have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, but that mutual defense will not apply to disputed territories in the South China Sea. Now, whatever you have by that time, well, that's something. But if you want to expand your footprint in the area, we're not going to get involved in that. So the United States adopted this position essentially of neutrality, whereby it says we have no position on the status of sovereignty over the disputed features, whether it's in paracels or particularly in the Spratlys where the Philippines has active claims. Now, that position was adopted with different variations and in different cadence, diplomatic cadence, all the way to the Obama administration. That is why when Obama visited the Philippines in 2014, he was absolutely clear that he's not going to be clear about whether our mutual defense treaty will be activated if we were to have a war with China. And this is relevant because in 2012, China effectively wrested control of the long-time Philippine claimed and the Philippines argue long-time Philippine controlled Scarborough Shoals. Because if you look at the Scarborough Shoal, this goes back to the Spanish colonial era, and this goes back to the Commonwealth era, and even much of the Cold War period when the United States and the Philippines would conduct military exercises in the Scarborough Shoal. But, the Philippines paid the price for its strategic complacency because unlike other countries in the region, it did not develop facilities there. The one area where we developed facilities, that's in the Pag-asa or Tito Island, no one has touched it because we have an airstrip there since the 1970s. We have troops there. We have a whole community there. We used to even have a resident mayor there. So those areas where we have a lot of people and troops, they're more or less safe. But places like Scarborough Shoal, we didn't even bother to put a lighthouse or some basic facility. So between 1990s and 2012, we at least lost two major features. One was the Mischief Reef, which we also used to claim, but China slowly and slowly took over, first sending fishermen. Next thing you know, there are PLA troops there. And then they more or less tried to replicate that. And eventually, in the case of Scarborough Shoal, we had a standoff with China. They had fishermen there. We mistakenly had a naval vessel apprehending the illegal fishermen because we didn't have the Coast Guard capability back then. And next thing you know, China sends an armada, and we had to back down. And we had to back down because the Obama administration was not willing to provide the direct support we were hoping. So eventually, the Obama administration forced the Philippines into some sort of a negotiation, which ended up with the Philippines withdrawing its naval vessel from the Scarborough Shoal. But the next thing you know, the Chinese have essentially cordoned off the area. So since 2012, China is exercising administrative and de facto control over the Scarborough Shoal. And yet, just 2 years after that, President Obama was still wishy-washy on whether the Mutual Defense Treaty would apply. He was twice asked by Filipino reporters in 2014, just hours after he signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the Philippines, that will the U.S. be more helpful, and he refused to provide any clear answer. So essentially, up until the Obama administration, the Americans wanted to enjoy access to Filipino bases, first through full-fledged bases throughout the Cold War period, and then through rotational access under the EDCA parameters. So it was only during Trump administration, and particularly in 2019, right after Donald Trump's second meeting with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, that back then U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo comes to Manila and makes it public. We will stand with the Philippines in the South China Sea if your troops, vessels, personnel are come under attack. And the Biden administration effectively adopted the same position And the second Trump administration obviously is continuing that legacy. So as far as America's commitment is concerned, it was really wishy-washy. There was a lot of ambiguity without much strategy. And only in the last half a decade or so, we see much more forceful and robust reassurances by the Americans. What's interesting, though, is that the Philippines is trying to have it both ways, right? So, on one hand, what we see under the Marcos Jr. administration is that there's more access given to the Americans, meaning new ETCA facilities whereby Americans can have a rotational access, not full-fledged bases. They could even put advanced weapon systems like the Typhoon missile systems, for instance. But these are not full-fledged bases. And some of these bases are both close to Taiwan and also the South China Sea. At the same time, the Philippine government has repeatedly and publicly turned down offers by the United States to accompany the Philippines during patrols across disputed areas. And of course, the most potentially explosive one is the Ayungin Shoal or the second Thomas Shoal, where we have a de facto naval base. So we grounded a World War II BRP Sierra Madre vessel there, which is effectively our naval facility there. It's a low tide elevation, meaning it's not even a territory to be claimed, but China claims it as if it's an island. It falls within our extended it's actually continental shelf. It's well within our exclusive economic zone. But most importantly, because we have troops there, it's absolutely clear that any attack on those troops will activate the Mutual Defense Treaty. So the only issue here is, should America be preemptively involved in making sure nothing funny happens there, or should America just be over the horizon? So far, the position of the Marcos Jr. administration is that the US should be just over the horizon. Why is the Marcos administration so particular about this? As you may know, it used to be in alliance with the Dutertes, and the Dutertes, of course, promised independence, basically from Americans, in favor of stronger ties with China. But after 6 years of strategic flirtation, Duterte didn't really have much to show, neither in terms of investments. What we had was pledge trap instead of debt trap. But more importantly, Duterte was not also able to prevent the Chinese from further militarizing disputed land features claimed by the Philippines and also expanding their presence in the area, including their militia forces in the area. So you had militarization and what I call militiaization of the disputes. So Marcos comes in and says, I also want diplomacy, but once he realized China is not going to listen to him by just talking nicely to each other, he leveraged the American alliance. So it's a very difficult balancing act. I think the Marcos administration trying to find that Goldilocks approach whereby you have just enough American presence in the area on Philippine soil, but not too much to make the Philippines either too dependent on the United States or to make himself look like an American puppet, which is basically the line of Duterte's. One of them is the vice president, and the other one, the ex-president Duterte, has been openly accusing his successor of being an American puppet. So it's a very difficult balancing act. Not only in terms of the Philippines making sure it doesn't get into war with China, it's also about making sure that it doesn't look like it's an American puppet. And that's why it's a difficult diplomacy for Philippines.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. You kind of addressed this already, but um, how are Filipino leaders assessing the current situation of just say, like Trump has maybe been doing a 180. He's been
Mm.
kind of bashing European allies, talking about annexing Greenland or even dissing Canada. Um, are Filipino leaders afraid that Asian allies such as the Philippines might be next? Or,
Right, good question. Jared, am I coming clear to you? Because you're pixelated to me. Am I clear enough to you?
yes, you are clear to me, and sorry if I'm a bit pixelated. Can you at least hear
Yeah,
me?
yeah. I just want to make sure on my side everything is fine. No worries about it. Okay. Fantastic question. Well,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. So, obviously, the easiest answer would be, oh, we're just weeks or months into the Trump administration. It's hard to say what's gonna happen. But honestly, I think if you have a proper framework, there's a way to approach this in a reasonable way. Basically, first of all, there's this argument that frontline Asian allies are going to be treated differently from European allies. Why? Because, first of all, China is seen as a direct threat to American global hegemony or leadership in ways Russia is not. And I'm not going to even talk about Trump's special penchant for Putin, right? And then Ukraine obviously is not a US treaty ally even. And that war has been dragging on and hundreds of billions of dollars has been spent. So there's this thinking in Asia that as difficult as it is to watch what's happening to Ukraine, this is part of a logical rebalancing towards Asia. And you have been hearing this from top American officials, whether it's Mike Waltz, whether it's Pete Hegseth, whether it's Marco Rubio. The idea is that we have to focus on China first, and therefore our Asian frontline allies are the most important one. So there's this idea that we will be first in line, and so far there's a few good indications. For instance, U.S. security aid to the Philippines has been exempted. It has been clarified that up to $5 billion in defense aid to the Philippines will push through, something that has bipartisan support, right? So there are some indications that maybe what's happening here is the rise of prioritizers, people like Elbridge Colby, who could be the next Undersecretary for Policy in Pentagon. And their argument is very simple, and I've interviewed these people in Manila and elsewhere. Their argument is, we would love to be helpful in Europe, Middle East, and all over the world, but this is the 21st century. China is a superpower, and there's just so much we can do. Let's just prioritize Asia. So that is the optimistic point of view. And to be honest, if you talk to Filipino officials, almost all of them on the record will say the same thing, that it's an Asia first, China focused, second Trump administration. So it's sorry to see what's happening to Europe, but guess what? Europeans are rich and they can take care of themselves and they can take care of Ukraine anyway. And in the case of the Middle East, if you look at the US allies like Israel, they're very well armed, they can take care of themselves. That's the optimistic point of view. And then there's a slightly more skeptical point of view, which is, well, we do have prioritizers like Elbridge Colby there. We do have very friendly top officials like Marco Rubio, who has consistently throughout the years called for strong Philippine-U.S. Security cooperation. But at the same time, you also have a lot of so-called restrainers or isolationist figures, including Andrew Byers, who's the guy who's heading the South and Southeast Asia Department at the Pentagon, who openly argued just months before getting appointed in multiple pieces, including in the American Conservative, also to a certain degree on foreign affairs, that, hey, what we should do is to pursue a grand bargain with China. He calls it a cooperation spiral. And interestingly, in one of his essays, he openly argued, in his co-authored essays, he argued that the US can do a deal with China whereby it withdraws unilaterally all its EDCA bases and weapon systems. In exchange, all China has to do is just to have fewer patrols in areas claimed by the Philippines. And that for us is troubling. That people who are openly arguing for cutting deals with China and just cutting the Philippines out are now in positions of influence. Which brings me to what happened between Zelensky and Trump, because we all knew that there were tensions between the Trump administration and Zelensky, but the way they just berated Zelensky, I'm not talking about Trump and J.D. Vance. I mean, I don't know, who was that guy? Was that the boyfriend of Marjorie Taylor Greene? I mean, like, the way, like, just any MAGA guy could go out there and berate a head of state the way they did, it viscerally actually troubled a lot of us. Some of us even had trouble sleeping, to be honest. Like, that was, you could easily imagine that's how any one of us could be treated by MAGA America. And more importantly, we are also seeing potential indications that Trump is not just here to cut deals with Putin. Probably Trump is here to completely restructure the global order, whereby, in the 19th century, there was a so-called Three Kaisers year. I forgot how to say it in German. The idea is that you had these illiberal leaders of Austria-Hungary, Germany, Prussia, and Tsarist Russia teaming up together to prevent another 1848 liberal revolution, right? Kind of I would say maximalist understanding. If Trump would say, what if Trump is really more interested in a tripolar world order, kind of a Yalta 2 or a Tehran Conference 2.0, whereby it's really China, Russia, and US together deciding what kinds of spheres of influence they're gonna run. And when Trump the way he talks about Panama, the way he talks about Greenland, the way he talks about Canada, not to mention Gaza, it sounds so William McKinley, the very person who completed American colonization of the Philippines. So for some people who are more historically minded, it's hard not to see that there's also a possibility this is not just a question of prioritizing Asia at the expense of the rest. This could be a question of global order restructuring, whereby Trump feels more affinity with illiberal superpowers, including China and Russia, among others, than with like-minded Asian democracies. And then, of course, there's another mid-range interpretation. Okay, Trump is just a real estate guy, businessman, but if you think of it as purely transactional terms, China can offer things that none of us can offer. I mean, they have the biggest consumer market. They are already direct competition in AI. You had discussions about a G2. Brzezinski, among others, have been advocating that for years. Kissinger was talking about that for decades. So there's also a fear that even if Trump is not ideologically into this kind of a three Kaiser world order, from a purely transactional point of view, what if China makes him an offer that he can't deny or ignore? And as part of that offer, it could be market concessions, it could be industrial policy concessions, it could be even military concessions, for instance, on hypersonic missiles, on artificial intelligence with military edge. And then and China will ask, okay, maybe you want to soften a little bit your commitment to the Philippines. And if you're Taiwan, actually, you're more worried, right? You know what's interesting is I used to be in Taiwan during Trump administration's first term. The Taiwanese loved Trump. You know, Pompeo almost visited them. All top officials visited them. I remember the Taiwanese were panicking when Biden won, thinking Democrats will be soft on China. And I kept on reassuring them, no, this is bipartisan. Strangely, if you go to Taiwan nowadays and you talk to them, they're worried about the second iteration of Trump because they feel this one is much more unvarnished and potentially much more ideologically hostile, or I would say non-committal rather, ideologically non-committal to fellow democracies in ways that it was not during its first term, when you had Mattis, when you had all of these kind of more traditionally oriented Republicans and individuals serving at the highest offices. So in short, there's higher level of unpredictability. There's a higher degree of fear that there could be always a grand bargain between US and China, not only US and Russia or US and Iran down the road. And that is why you have no less than the Philippine ambassador to the United States, Babe Romualdez, essentially indicating that, the logical way forward is we all have to take care of ourselves at some point, right? Now, you cannot do that overnight. China is just so ahead of all of us, so we will need the United States as some sort of counterbalance. But as we speak, you had the Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary just days, if not hours, after meeting Rubio on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. Both of us had interviews with Financial Times. You can check the quotes themselves. Basically, he said that, you know, maybe the Philippines has to diversify its relations. In fact, in the Philippines, we are using the term multi-alignment, which is a term that Jai Shankar and the Indians use a lot, which is the idea is that don't align yourself to just one power, diversify it. And as part of that, actually in April, there is a plan to invite a couple of middle power countries or mid-sized countries like ours. It could be India, it could be France. In fact, Macron could be visiting the Philippines after his speech in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue also later this year. So what's happening right now is what I call strategic collective bargaining. This idea that US allies in Asia and Europe are going to work more together and at times probably will work more together to restrain the United States if they feel Trump is moving in a crazy direction. We're already seeing that at the level of Europe among Europeans, right? Immediately after the Zelensky incident, he was back in Europe and the Europeans had a summit and they all stood behind Ukraine. Maybe logical next step would be Japan, Philippines, Australia, and all having kind of a summit and meeting with counterparts in Europe to also discuss how to preserve a rules-based international order. The reality is this: I've been in discussion with heads of states and officials from countries that are not US and China, but still among the biggest economies in the world. And off the record, they have been saying this for years. We don't want the world to be dictated by the whims of the man either in White House or the Zhongnanhai. Oh, and definitely not in Kremlin, right? So the idea of Asia, Europe, fellow democracies working together, BRICS plus, those things are going to gain momentum because, to be honest, otherwise, if you just fully rely on the US and hope for the best and not prepare for the worst, you're committing a strategic suicide or at least recklessness. So, just to put it simply, the argument a lot of us are making is this: the US alliance matters. We want the US to be involved to counterbalance China, but we rather want to have a seat at the table because we fear we might end up as the food on the menu. That is our worry. And I think that's a worry that a lot of us share, just to different degrees. So it's really a question of variation on the theme.
All right, thank you so much for that. I just have one last question, and it's a repeat of what you asked you earlier. if you can just, and you don't have to go in as detail as before, but if you can just explain again the geopolitical significance of the South China Sea. The reason I'm asking you again is if you could just say that, but just looking at the camera,
Yeah,
just
sure, sure.
uh,
Well, as far as the South China Sea disputes are concerned, this is where the parameters of U.S.-China competition is most poignant, if not potentially explosive. What we're looking at is a confluence of many clashing interests. On one hand, you have clashing narratives, nationalistic and patriotic narratives. China's narrative is that basically South China Sea, East China Sea, there are blue national soil. Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan Straits is part of us. And in the case of the Philippines, we call our exclusive economic zone in the area. We have legislated along those ways. As the West Philippine Sea, we filed an arbitration case against China to prove our claims in the area and to disprove China's nine dash line. And you have versions of that all across the region. The Vietnamese call their own exclusive economic zone their East China Sea. The Malaysians are probably thinking about calling it North Borneo Sea. The Indonesians, who are not direct claims to the South China Sea, are also having disputes with China because the Natuna Islands area, which by the way are also very energy rich, have overlapping with the tip of China's nine dash line, which covers 85% of the entire South China Sea basin. And as far as that basin is concerned, it is an artery of global trade. You could see numbers between $3 to $5 trillion of trade, and this is trade not only between Europe and Asia or US and Asia, it's global trade basically. It's a global artery of trade. More importantly, and this is where it's not just a question of hegemonic struggles or patriotic narratives, it's also a question of food and energy security. There are untold amounts of fishery resources, and hundreds of millions of people in the region, literal states, rely on the South China Sea for their protein intake. Not to mention, there's also an untold amount of oil and gas resources, particularly in the Reed Bank area, which falls within the Philippines exclusive economic zone, but also falls within China's nine dash line. And we have been having tussles with the Chinese. This is a desperate situation for the Philippines because our only major source of liquefied natural gas, our major source of electricity generation, is running out. The Malampaya plant is running out very soon. And if we don't develop the Reed Bank, we'll be very dependent on imports. LNG is very expensive if you buy it from Qatar, if you buy it from across the oceans. We need to develop them, but we're not able to develop them because China doesn't allow us to explore those areas. We tried some sort of joint exploration deals, but no Filipino president, even someone as shameless as Duterte and his henchmen, did not dare to do that because they could be accused of treason, right? And it goes against our constitution and the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award based on the relevant provisions of international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And then there's all other factors that come together here because the United States wants to have consistent access to this area to project power, to be able to be there for its allies and friends. At the same time, for China, they believe kind of like their own Monroe Doctrine, the same way that Trump talks about Panama, Canada, Greenland. Well, guess what? The Chinese talk in similar ways about South China Sea, East China Sea. Essentially, this is our backyard, the so-called first island chain, and they feel as the at least second most powerful country on earth, they're entitled to have a sphere of influence there. So ironically, China is copying the West in trying to establish a sphere of influence in its immediate maritime backyard. But from the Chinese perspective, they're just trying to recreate what they used to have before the advent of European colonialism, which was this tributary system, whereby China was the middle kingdom and all of us, the little boys from Korea to Vietnam to the Philippines, we just have to kowtow to them. So this is it. This is where you see this bizarre combination of China replicating America's Monroe Doctrine and at the same time China trying to recreate its historical ideas of hegemony and primacy as the middle kingdom in this part of the world.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you answering that again. Last question I have is there anything that you want to mention or address that I may have not asked you in my questions, or just something you think that's important to kind of add to this conversation?
Well, I mean, for me, one thing we shouldn't forget is that other middle powers also have a role to play. Japan, for instance, is a country that is playing a very important role in the South China Sea. Many countries see, essentially Japan as the Robin to the Batman of the US, right? Like the American sidekick. But actually in Southeast Asia, Japan is almost like a superpower. Their biggest source of foreign direct investments and infrastructure development sometimes way bigger than China in places like the Philippines, places like Vietnam. So the Japanese have a lot of economic muscle, not to mention cultural influence. The Asian Development Bank's headquarters is actually in Manila. And Japan is also developing security relationship with Southeast Asian countries, particularly those ones who have clashing claims with China. So Japan single-handedly has helped the Philippines to enjoy one of the most capable and proactive coast guards in the region. The Filipino Coast Guard now is at the forefront of what we call the Transparency Initiative, which is they go toe to toe with the Chinese and then they publicize whatever bullying incident or clashes they have. That's how confident and capable the Philippine Coast Guard has become from almost being non existent. Remember, we discussed the 2012 Scarborough Shoal crisis? We didn't even have a single patrol vessels that could go that far away. Now we have a couple of world-class patrol vessels, and a number of them are actually provided by Japan. Japan has also provided Coast Guard vessels to Vietnam, to Malaysia, is also helping Indonesia with its maritime security. So Japan over the past decade has become a very important security partner. And guess what? They also signed a reciprocal access agreement with the Philippines, which allows them to have almost a de facto visiting forces agreement with us, for them to have regular joint exercises with us, for them to send us their most advanced weapon systems maybe down the road, but at least for now help us with our domain awareness and maritime security. And by the way, Japan together with the United States is also pushing for a trilateral framework of US, Japan, Philippines security cooperation, also in preparation of potential contingencies in Taiwan. So much is going on, and Japan is also very much at the center of these conversations.
All right, I appreciate it. That's all you find. All you can go ahead and stop the recording. And if you could just stay on real quick to make sure it uploads for both of us.
Sure, sure. You're uploading it now. Okay, fantastic.
Oh, seems like it's been uploaded on both our ends. Yeah,
Uh
well,
oh.
I really appreciate this, and thanks for bearing with me with the massive time difference. So,
Sure, no problem, Jerry. And thank you for showing more love and support for your mother country. It's always sweet to see more Philams
yeah, hope
paying
to,
more attention to the Philippines. I see a lot of that
yes,
nowadays, so I'm very glad to see that. To be honest, talking to a lot of Philams throughout the
okay,
years.
yeah. Well, yeah, it's nice speaking to a fellow Filipino. So, thank you so much. And if I have any like clarification questions,
Yes,
just
just send me and I
do you
can
mind if I
get
just
back to you on
email you?
WhatsApp or something. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you too. Take care.
Thank you. Talk to you soon, Jared. Have a good day. Thank you. Kamusta guys? Sorry again. Sabi ko, matagal din yata tong interview to. Might as well put some part of it. Some part of it. Anyways guys, to be honest, medyo pagod pa ako. I'm still trying to recover from our long day yesterday and yung lagnat and all. So, di tayo anyways, actually not here but on Facebook nang taping na tayo. So there are going to be new episodes coming out soon. Check out the latest episodes by Ronald that I uploaded last night, and then also some of the ones we had recently. And then tomorrow we're going to be joined by Justice Scarpio to discuss again legal issues and all of that. And then Saturdays we're going to start, of course, our R&D with Dino De Leon, Attorney De Leon. We're going to talk about important legal issues. All right. Salamat guys. God bless and talk to you soon. And don't forget to be members dito sa YouTube natin. Mura lang, at the price of one pickup coffee, you can become a member monthly. Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.